So we'll make a start. I'm Alex Sobel and I'm Member of Parliament for Leeds Central and Headingley, and I've been involved with the Barghouti campaign. Really, I've known about Marwan Barghouti and the need for him to be released for a long time, but really it's through meeting Arab a couple of years ago at the house of Gabrielle Rifkind, who from Oxford Process, who was very involved with the Oslo Accords and the process, developing the process for Oslo. And, you know, there are many different interwoven issues in Palestine, but without leadership, we're not going to get to a two-state solution. We're not going to have a viable independent Palestinian state. With Marwan in prison, that is very difficult to achieve. And it's also a matter of justice, which I'm sure we'll hear of later, particularly from Simon. So I'll just do a little bit of an intro. MP colleagues will come in and out. That's the nature of the place. There's an urgent question on Palantir, which I know there'll be an overlap of interest. So people might come in quite late once that is finished or they've spoken in that, and other people might have to go. So that's how we operate in Parliament. But I'm really pleased that this meeting is hosted by the All-Party Parliamentary Human Rights Group, and I'd like to thank their chair, Fabian Hamilton, and their secretariat, Nicole Peace, who's done a lot of work on organising this event. And I'd like to also thank Paul Waugh, who's helped me organise the event as well in my own office, and working with the Free Marwan, Free Palestine campaign, which we've been doing for a number of months now in the run-up to the launch of the international campaign. So we're going to hear from an expert panel, starting with Arab, and then British actor, producer and activist Khalid Abdalla, who I'm sure everybody recognises from many different television shows and films, and finally from Simon Foreman, which is very lucky. Simon's come over to the UK because he was the IPU lawyer who observed the trial all of those years ago. Each panelist will speak for around 10 minutes, and then we'll share next steps that we can take as parliamentarians, and then we'll have time for a Q&A and a photo at the end. I'm not sure whether we'll be able to get Arab in on the screen or not, but we'll do our best. The new international campaign to free Marwan, officially launched on 29th of November, is facilitated by civil society groups in the UK and includes an international network of country-led campaigners, along with global public figures, world leaders, and Nobel Prize laureates through the elders, who I'm sure everybody knows, legal experts like Simon, and activists. It builds on the first international campaign launched by Marwan Barghouti, Marwan's wife, with prominent South African political and anti-apartheid activist Ahmed Kathrada, from the prison cell where both Kathrada and Nelson Mandela were incarcerated. Nobel laureates including former President Jimmy Carter, Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu, and over 15 former heads of state signed the Robben Island Declaration calling for Marwan's release. Raja Musawi, Sarah North and James Sidri are here from the campaign. Thank you all for your help in organising this. So first of all, we're going to go over to Arab, who is in Palestine. I think everybody knows Arab is Marwan's son and has tirelessly campaigned for his release and has been over to the UK a number of times. We're hoping to welcome him again soon. And Arab will speak publicly about his father's role in Palestinian politics and the advocacy that he's doing, raising international awareness of both his father's detention and broader concerns for Palestinian political prisoners. He has been widely quoted in international media urging global support for his father's release as a catalyst for legitimate Palestinian leadership, unity, democracy and self-determination. I think maybe it's worth saying also at this point that we're expecting a book later in the year from Marwan, so Arab I'm sure will tell us about that as well. So Arab, over to you.
Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you. So I'm really glad to be here. I've been to the House a few times to address the issue of my father and the issue, of course, of the Palestinian cause and Palestinian politics in general. I just want to start with thanking Paul, Simon, Khalid, and the Human Rights APPG. You know, this is a very important issue because I think many people, when they talk about Palestinian political prisoners, and especially when it comes to my father's issue, many people look at it as, you know, a symbolic issue. And I think that it's our job to correct that, because it's not a symbolic issue. It's a need for the Palestinian people right now. If we look at what the Palestinian people have gone through in the last 2+ years, we will find that yes, we were, of course, a victim of the aggression of the current Israeli government, a government that, you know, has all the space and blank check by the international community to do whatever they want with the Palestinian people. But I'm not here to complain about that. I'm here to show a pathway that is different, and a political pathway that is different and that can change the status quo. in the last few months, we saw that the UK and many other countries have recognized the Palestinian state. But I think that the recognition by itself is going to be considered as symbolic in history books as long as there are no actual steps that are being taken on the ground. And to go back and to give some context there, I feel that it's been a shame on the Palestinian politics and leadership side that we didn't have any political initiative that can change the status quo and change the political infrastructure in general. I think that we were on the receiving end of all the political initiatives that came from the international community, but there was a very clear and obvious lack of Palestinian political initiatives. And this is exactly why we were calling for the democratic renewal of the Palestinian politics. If we want to be honest and take a deep look at the Palestinian politics, we haven't had elections for more than 20 years. We don't have a legislative council for 19 years at the moment. And you all know as parliamentarians how that can make a whole political system dysfunctional. And I think that if we think about it, we need to change that. And changing that can only happen with the democratic renewal and with a new pathway, a new leadership that really represents the people. And I think that these temporary or shortcuts into, a solution and bringing different committees and stuff like that is not going to solve it on the long run. That doesn't mean that we're against anything that can make the lives of the people in Gaza especially, but also in the West Bank, better in the immediate term. But I think not having that with a clear vision towards a democratic renewal will be very problematic, and we will be unfortunately making the same mistakes again and again. And I think that we really welcome the decision of having the Fatah Party Conference, which my father is a Central Committee member of, that will happen in May 14th. And then we will have the Palestinian National Council elections in November that will replace the Palestinian Parliament. At least we will have that function within the Palestinian politics, and it will give many people the opportunity to participate in elections. And hopefully we will see younger faces. We will see more women participation in Palestinian politics and the whole new face of the Palestinian politics, because as long as we're not unified and we don't know what we want, there is no way we can get to what we want. And as Palestinians, we lack that in general. And I think that's exactly why people look at my father as a source of hope. I always say my father doesn't have the magic stick. He's not going to change everything and fix it in one moment. But I think that he represents a clear foundation towards that path. And if anyone follows his political career, you will find that he's someone who's very brave in the struggle against the Israeli occupation for more than 50 years, where he spent more than 30 years in prison, 7 years of exile, and he knew exactly what he was signing up for and the sacrifices that he was going to have to pay for. But at the same time, he was also very brave in the peace process. And if you ask many of the Israeli officials who dealt with him personally, they are the ones who are right now, and in the past 2 decades, they were the ones who asked for his release, because they know what he represents for the Palestinian people, because they know that he's brave in the peace process. And he's always said that the peace, but for example, Oslo is an opportunity that needs to be given an opportunity. And he's the one who was convincing the Palestinian people with that. But then we also what happened in what's known as the second Intifada, the Palestinian uprising in 2000. And I will leave the legal issues to Mr. Simon, who is way more qualified than me and has covered it. And I would love to learn more about the unlawful court and sentence that my father has gotten in Israeli prisons. His continued imprisonment is a political problem. And if we look at the last 15 years, you will find that more than 800 Palestinians with life sentences have been released by the Israeli government in different exchanges with with Israeli captives as well. But they keep avoiding my father's name time and time again. And we need to ask ourselves why. And it's because it's very obvious, it's not a secret anymore, that this current Israeli government doesn't want peace. They want only peace that includes full dominance over the Palestinian people. This is a government that has been vocal about their plans of and objectives of ethnically cleansing the Palestinian people. They have committed a genocide against the people of Gaza, and right now they are basically saying that Oslo doesn't work anymore, doesn't exist in the current political situation. And I think this is very dangerous, because what they're after they did what they did in Gaza and make it inhabitable, their second biggest threat is having a Palestinian legitimate representation and the Palestinian agency, and that's exactly where it comes to the Palestinian Authority. And yes, the Palestinian Authority hasn't been popular at all, and I'm one of their biggest critics when it comes to their performance. But that doesn't mean that we have, we're ready to let go of the only Palestinian agency that represents the Palestinian people. The current Israeli government is very obvious and clear about their intentions of killing that agency, so the Palestinian people don't have representation, and then they can continue towards their full annexation of the West Bank and continue to make the lives of the people of Gaza hell on purpose, so they can dominate the whole land. And I think that perpetuates the cycle of violence. Anyone that has, any information about the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict will understand that these solutions have never worked. It's brought more and more violence. And I think that in order for us to stop that violence, we need to come to the table, we need to negotiate. And in order for us to get there, we need a Palestinian leadership that really represents the Palestinian people, so they can sell any political settlement towards the Palestinian people, because you can't blame the Palestinians at the moment that we don't trust the international community, we don't trust the mediation of certain countries, and we don't trust, of course, the Israeli government that is very vocal about their intentions of killing the Palestinian people's dream of statehood. And I think that, the position of the UK as a defender of international law is very important. The UK is engaged in deep discussions when it comes to Palestinian future. And I think that in order for them to really help the Palestinian politics and the Palestinian agency, they need to make sure that Marwan Barghouti represents a way to move forward from where we're at within the Palestinian politics. We also shouldn't forget that my father has been a Palestinian parliamentarian for 30 years. He's still a parliament member. And I think that, of course, Israel did not have any legitimacy in arresting him or kidnapping him from Ramallah and moving him into Tel Aviv and giving him all of what we saw in his trial. Now, what we're asking for is going to be covered, of course, when we get to the actions. But I think that, honestly, I've been going back and forth to the UK, to London, and I have been in the Parliament meeting MPs a lot, and I see that there is a lot of collaboration from many of them, but at the same time, it wasn't a position that the UK government is taking. And I think it's time to take braver steps, and saying we support the two-state solution without doing anything about it is deepening the problem, because you're just giving the Palestinian people false hopes. And if you're really serious about taking steps into helping the Palestinian people into having our dream of statehood that can end this cycle of violence once and for all, I think that supporting Palestinian democracy is very important. Supporting the Palestinian agency that is operating at the moment, even though you could call it dysfunctional in so many ways, but that's the function that is already there. We need to support it. And the third thing is calling for the release of my father. Of course, many people will take it as a humanitarian issue, which it is. In the last 2 years, my father has been through a lot. He's been in solitary confinement right after October 7th until today, which is, of course, part of the collective punishment policy of the Israeli government, because obviously he had nothing to do with that. But at the same time, he was assaulted multiple times. He got injured. He suffers from broken ribs as we speak from the security guards. And if that's not not an invitation to speak out against the violations, the clear violations of international law. I don't think what is. My expectations is that the UK government would even take it further to call for his release so he can change the status quo and the Palestinian politics and take us into a path where there is a real hope for a political settlement. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'll be here for any questions after we listen from the others. Thank you.
Thank you, Arab. I think that was a really important contribution from Arab for the MPs here, and has got quite a lot of colleagues in the room, actually particularly from my party, which is the party of government here, which is really important, obviously. I just want to say that something you didn't mention, which I think is important to mention, is that the Israeli Minister Ben-Gvir went and personally threatened your father in his prison cell and told him there would never be a Palestinian state. The UK government had already sanctioned Ben-Gvir as well as Smotrich, but there is much more that we need to do. I raised after that with David Lammy that incident, and the response was not good enough. He was the Foreign Secretary at the time, and I've raised since with Hamish Fulton. We had a better response, but still the government's position needs to be a lot stronger with regard to your father. I'm sure all my colleagues in the room would agree, and that's why they're here. So there's work for us to do, and your continuing advocacy, Arab, is really important. So we do really welcome what you've said today online, but would even more welcome you in the building as well to say that, and to try and ensure we get you meetings with the Foreign Office when you come. But I'd like to go on to our next speaker. In November, we launched the campaign. The campaign was accompanied by a letter signed by, I don't want to say the word celebrities, but well-known figures in the worlds of art and the creative industries. As chair of the music group here, I helped get some musicians to sign it, but I'm really lucky today that we've got Khalid Abdalla, who's an actor, a producer, a writer, who was the signatory to the letter and also helped organise the Together Palestine concert at Wembley Arena last year. You might recognise him from The Crown, Day of the Jackal, and of course The Kite Runner. And his debut play, Nowhere, is in part a response to events in Gaza and his experience of revolution in Egypt, and is currently touring the world to critical acclaim. I've not been to see it yet, but hopefully. And he's also an honorary fellow of Queen's College, Cambridge. So Khalid, over to you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a real honour to be here, and it's always a real honour to stand in any form, really, in relation to the Marwan Barghouti campaign and in support of Arab and his family. As you said, I was one of over 200, I think the number is now rising, but one of over 200 cultural figures from across the world who have signed on to this campaign. Many of them figures whose names also kind of may not always have signed on to Palestinian, which is not, not to throw something at them, but it is a broad consensus issue when you read the names that include the likes of Ian McKellen and Annie Lennox and Rebecca Solnit, and and also the breadth of backgrounds. And it's an honour to have been part of that. There's the obvious glaring question: why are we as cultural figures needing to do that? And I think it's important to say this in Parliament, that with the exception of notable figures, many of whom are in the room, that part of the reason that cultural figures need to respond in this way is because there is an absolute failure of political leadership. And that failure makes it incumbent upon us, wherever we are, to move the cultural debate forward so that politics can catch up. It remains within certain segments of society controversial to say that what happened over the last 2 years, despite the fact that the UN Commission of Inquiry has said so, despite the fact that all the great humanitarian organizations have said so, despite the fact of the ruling in the ICJ and genocide scholars across the board, that this has been a genocide, what has happened over the last 2 years. And apparently that remains controversial in some sectors and certainly in government. I am someone, I assume, like many of the signatories, who have signed on to this campaign, who cannot accept to ever go back to a day in which this genocide, which has happened on our collective watch, happens again. And I want to live true to the words never again in their absolute meaning of being never again for anyone. The question, I think, for all of us is, what do we do over these next 10 years that mean we are never here again. It's taken 77, 78 years from a Palestinian context to arrive at this moment of global consciousness. And over the last 2 years, of course, the primary demands have been to have a ceasefire and end the genocide, which, by the way, still continues. Since October 10th, over 500 Palestinians have been killed. That is double the number of hostages who were taken. And the double standard there is glaring. Which is not to, obviously not to say that that's not also extremely important. It's not to diminish from the importance of the hostages. It's to say that the double standard exists and that the genocide continues, as we're seeing with Palestinians not receiving enough aid and so on. But we've been doing all of that. The question for us, likewise, is what do we do? Not what do we stop, but what do we do from a political point of view? And the obvious answer, who is languishing in jail and has been now for, 24 years, is Marwan Barghouti. He is the most popular political figure in Palestine. As we heard, his campaign when the last time it was remounted was from Robben Island, from Nelson Mandela's prison cell with Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Nelson Mandela himself said that Marwan Barghouti's case is exactly the same as mine. And that is what gives, not just that it gives both the moral and the political grounding to say that this is the kind of solution that we should be working towards. Not the Board of Peace type version of things, whether represented, frankly, in Donald Trump and Tony Blair and likewise, or the Netanyahu government, and this idea which comes from a colonial mindset of, like the British Mandate originally, that the Palestinians are not in a state to be able to look after themselves and deal with their own democracy. We just heard from Marwan the eloquence of that. So, just imagine if his father was speaking, not to diminish from Arab. Arab is a great speaker. But we know that the potential for the political leadership exists. That is fundamentally being thwarted on every level and has been since Oslo, certainly since the Second Intifada, why did that emerge? It emerged because of the failure of Oslo. So Marwan Barghouti's release, as well as him being the figure, I believe, who really has the ability to unify and move things forward, it signals internationally and within Palestine and within Israel that there is now genuine efforts being made towards a political solution. Without that, then what you've got is the attempt to divide and rule, not allow a genuine leadership to emerge, not allow any genuine political possibilities to emerge, and so you can always point the finger and say, oh, well, who do I speak to, etc. No, there is someone very clear to speak to, and there is a reason why Ben-Gvir, who, as we said, is sanctioned in the UK, who is the person responsible for looking after the prisons, goes in and points an electric chair at Arab's father's face to say, this is what your fate is going to be, and we'll never have a Palestinian state. It's because they are trying to thwart its possibility of ever appearing. So we, internationally, and particularly Britain, as the world of international law is being unraveled, have a huge responsibility to move forward. And that's what, hopefully, as one of 200 cultural figures I am trying to represent, and with also notable figures within the world of politics who are here today trying to move forward with.
So finally, before we open the floor up, we've got Simon Foreman, a member of the executive of the British group of the Inter-Parliamentary Union. I've been to a number of assemblies where Marwan's case has been part of the deliberations. So it is a very high priority within the Inter-Parliamentary Union. They appointed Simon in 2004 to report on the trial. Simon concluded that Barghouti's proceeding failed to meet international fair trial standards, identify multiple breaches of international law, contributed to Barghouti's conviction life sentence. His assessment drew on court documents, in-person observations of the sessions. I just want to say that I've had quite a number of people, including from my own community, I'm Jewish, say that Marwan Barghouti is a terrorist, and that is based upon their reading of the trial. So what Simon's saying here isn't a matter of dry legalese. It is really important for us to make a case in this country internationally about why Marwan Barghouti is a political figure who is fighting for the freedom of his people. And I think that what Simon has to say is really important for us as politicians making that case, but also as public figures. And I feel particular responsibility for that in my own community where views are mixed, shall we say. So over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much to all of you for having me today in London. I need to start with an apology. I can speak English roughly, but French is my mother tongue. So sometimes I need to stop and look for words, try to remember how do you say this in English. Please bear with me if that happens. Yes, as you were saying, the Inter-Parliamentary Union asked me in 2003 to draft a report about the trial. He was arrested in April 2002. The trial, as you can see, there are different steps, ended in September 2003. And that is precisely when the IPU made the decision to send an observer to the trial. But at the time the decision was made, the trial itself had ended. So instead of attending the trial and observing the trial itself, which I could no longer do, and which in any event would have been difficult because I have had the experience of observing trials in Israel and occupied territories. And even with an interpreter, it's always difficult to follow what goes on in Hebrew. I had, I think, a much more interesting opportunity to go to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv in December 2003 to meet with the different actors in the trial, meet with Marwan Barghouti's legal team, to meet with the prosecution's legal team. The Israeli prosecutor was very welcoming. She received me at her offices in Tel Aviv, together with representatives of the ministries of Foreign Affairs and Justice. They provided me with copies of the proceedings of the trial, which I've had time to have translated and study in depth. What the IPU expected from me was to make an analysis of all this, compared with the standards of what is a fair trial under international law. And that was the basis of this report, which I think is still on the IPU website, which is about 20 pages long, 25 pages long. The conclusions I briefly summarize. The problematic issues of compliance with international laws. Marwan Barghouti was arrested in Ramallah, which is in Zone A, which is under the jurisdiction, according to the Oslo agreements, which is under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian police and judiciary. He was arrested by the Israeli military forces who entered his house, captured him, and took him to Jerusalem, where he was detained in a prison called the Russian Compound, detained and interrogated. It all starts with how he was arrested, because there are issues under the Oslo agreements. The Oslo agreements were not respected. The Israeli authorities explained that they could not rely on the Palestinian Authority to prosecute people suspect of complicity with terrorism in Palestine, so they had to do the job themselves. This entitled them to go to Ramallah, arrest Barghouti and bring him back to an Israeli prison. This is the first legal issue, the compliance with the Oslo Agreement, and also compliance with the Geneva Conventions. The fourth Geneva Convention has a provision, I think it's Article 49, that says individual of mass forcible transfers from occupied territory to the territory of the occupying power are prohibited. It's pretty straightforward. It doesn't require much imagination to understand. Yet, Israeli Supreme Court, not in the Barghouti case, but a few years back, I think in 1988, construed those provisions as meaning that the authors of the Geneva Convention, which was drafted just after World War II, had in mind mass transfers of people and not individual. And they didn't, at the time when the convention was drafted, they didn't have in mind a situation where the occupying country would be faced with terrorism organized from the occupied territory. So the argument from the Supreme Court was that the Geneva Convention does not prohibit individual arrests, which is a clear contradiction with the Geneva Convention itself, according to international lawyers and specialists. But that is the position of the Israeli authorities. In any event, Oslo Accords and Geneva Conventions are not part of domestic law in Israel. So those issues were raised as preliminary objections during the trial, but the courts did not have a jurisdiction to enforce international law directly in a criminal court of law. So they were not addressed in a direct manner. The next issue is how the investigation went. Marwan was arrested in April 2002, on the 15th of April. He was brought in the evening to the Russian compound in Jerusalem. 3 days later, he was allowed to meet his lawyer on the 18th of April. And after that first meeting, the Israeli authorities issued a decision to forbid any contacts with family, lawyers, any visits were forbidden. A situation of total incommunicado detention, and that lasted for 1 month. During that period of 1 month, that is a period when he was interrogated. So all of his interrogation, including statements allegedly made by him during his interrogation that were relied upon by the court a year later, all of that happened during that incommunicado period when he was not assisted by a lawyer, when he was not entitled to have any visits, and when he met his lawyers for the first time after the interrogation at the end of May, Marwan explained that he was interrogated under torture. The interrogations were in a way that is tolerated by the Israeli Supreme Court, that relies heavily on sleep deprivation during interrogations. Sleep deprivations, which is combined with something called the shabé. The shabé is it's usually regarded as torture, really. It's obliging someone who is, especially in a situation of sleep deprivation, making it impossible for that person to even simply relax. The chair that they are given to rest and to sit down, the chair has nails coming out of the back of the chair, which means you can never lie on the back of the chair. You have to sit on the edge of the chair 4 hours and go through the interrogation. And the interrogation goes together with sleep deprivation, which is tolerated by the Israeli Supreme Court. As I said, international bodies have repeatedly described as a direct violation of the United Nations Convention Against Torture, of which Israel is a party. So he did make these allegations that he was tortured, that he was interrogated under duress, but he also said that he had never confessed to any of the crimes that he was accused of. And it's interesting to insist about this because during this incommunicado detention period, there were leaks in the Israeli press that said that Marwan Barghouti had confessed on organizing terrorist attacks. And those confessions, how did they arrive in the media? How did they arrive to Israeli journalists who published them? He had no communication with anyone. The leaks could only come from the security services themselves. And of course, when I think on the 22nd of May or 21st of May, he had his first private meeting with his lawyers, that was the first question that they asked him when I met them. They told me, did you really confess? And he said, no, never. I never confessed about that. One of the big issues is that the allegations of torture were never investigated, and that the statements obtained from a prisoner without the assistance of a lawyer create a situation which is incompatible with international standards. The fair trial standards are mainly set down in the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. That is an international treaty set up by the United Nations that entered into force in 1976, if my memory is right. And the ICCPR sets up a specific committee, the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations, which is entitled to shed light on the provisions of the covenant and interpret the provisions of the covenant. And under those provisions and the interpretation of that committee, interrogating a suspect without the assistance of a lawyer, delaying the appearance of the suspect before a judge, torturing the suspect. All of this makes statements obtained from that suspect, how do you say that in English, irrecevable, inadmissible. Yes, I think we should perhaps turn to the fair trial rights. Thank you, Alex. Inadmissible. The evidence obtained in such circumstances is evidence that is tainted, that is inadmissible and vitiated because it is obtained through violations of basic fundamental rights. During the trial itself, which started a few months later, I think the trial started in April 2002, the presiding judge interrupted Marwan Barghouti, who was explaining that he had always advocated peace. The presiding judge interrupted him, saying, "One who fights for peace doesn't turn people into bombs." When you're the presiding judge in a criminal court, you're supposed to at least pretend to be impartial or keep your opinion for yourself. At the end of the trial, of course, your duty is to declare whether the suspect, whether the accused is guilty or innocent. But declaring him guilty of turning people into bombs before the trial actually had even begun was a clear violation of the presumption of innocence. I mentioned the media campaign before the verdict with leaks in the media. The defense team had troubles attending the trial itself. The trial was very much open to the media. Journalists from all around the world were invited. There were press stands outside of the courtroom for the prosecution to make press conferences, for instance. But Marwan Barghouti's team had trouble accessing on the first day, accessing the courtroom, and they had to enter through a side door because there were so many obstacles for them to access to the trial. Marwan Barghouti had also appointed 2 French lawyers to be part of his team of lawyers. They couldn't plead in court because there are only members of the Israeli bar are allowed to plead in court, but they were not even permitted to attend the trial. One of them, which is a quite famous lawyer in France, Gisèle Halimi, she passed away a few years ago, but she was a French ambassador and she was a member of the French Parliament also. When she arrived at Tel Aviv airport, she was detained for a couple of hours, interrogated about the Barghouti trial. She said that as a lawyer she didn't have a duty to respond to questions, but the police at the airport took her files, made photocopies of the file, which is a clear violation of the legal privilege of lawyers. So all this context make it impossible in light of international rules to consider that the conviction was made through the process of a fair trial. On the substance of the conviction itself, the prosecution called for 96 witnesses. Of the 96 witnesses, 63 were investigators. So none of them could be witnesses of anything that Marwan did or didn't do. 12 were victims of terrorist attacks. They could describe the terrorist attacks they had been victims of, but they couldn't say anything about Marwan's involvement. So this left only 21 witnesses that could possibly testify about his involvement, and not one of them testified that he had any involvement. And 12 of the 21 actually exonerated him explicitly. The notion that the trial made it possible to hear witnesses that comforted his guilt is not confirmed by the way the trial actually took place. The bottom line is that, as I said, the violations of international standards were such that I was not able to reach another conclusion, that it was not a fair trial under international standards.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
That's the important thing for us to take away. There wasn't a fair trial under international standards. Just, I'm going to bring Paul in, just ask the panel a question, say a few words. But there are these asks on this piece of paper. I won't read them out because we haven't got time. But it'd be great if Parliament should do them. I didn't know we had a WhatsApp group, so I'll be joining that after the end of this meeting. It's new, I think. So, Paul.
Hi, I'm Paul Worley from Rochdale. But when I visited Israel and Palestine last year, two things happened. One is I met Arab, and it was fantastic to meet him and hear his father's story, and hear the human story and the human cost about his imprisonment and the absolute injustice of not just the trial but his treatment subsequently. But what I also was really struck by on that visit was meeting former Israeli diplomats, senior diplomats, former Israeli senior military and senior intelligence officers who all said the same thing, that Marwan Barghouti is their partner for peace. He's the guarantor of Israeli security as well as Palestinian justice. And that was really, really powerful to hear that from the Israeli establishment. They're not in power at the moment. These are the people who are part of the Oslo sequence. But they're very, very passionate about if Israel has to have security at all, it has to have peace. And the only credible way to peace is having a credible partner. And as Arab has quite rightly said, he's the one figure that can unite the Gazans, he can unite people from the West Bank, because he's got so much credibility. And what you often don't hear about are the detail of what he's been doing in prison. He's been giving lectures for the prisoners, the fantastic work he does in promoting peace in everything he does from within prison. And Arab made a really, really valid point. He's a fellow parliamentarian, and I think us as parliamentarians here need to constantly say that and recognise we've got a fellow parliamentarian who's unjustly imprisoned. And that's why the IPU is so important in this, as well as the Parliamentary Group on Human Rights. We need to keep remembering there's someone who represents his people who's being imprisoned illegally, not just under Israeli law, but under international law. And that's why going through the detail of the case is really important, but also why we need to recognise that we can do something about it. And I raised Ben Gvir's appalling treatment, as is Alex. I raised it with the Minister. Hamish Faulkner was at least more willing to engage with the issue. But it's clear what's happened at the moment. They're trying, the extremists in the Israeli government are trying to use Marwan as yet another excuse to bring in an even more extreme law, which would be capital punishment. And so we need to stop that as a first priority. But secondly, just make sure that if we as a government have done something historic, which is recognise the Palestinian state. But that's just the first step, the first building block. The real peace is by engaging with genuine partners for peace, like Marwan Barghouti. There cannot be a two-state solution without him, and we need to keep saying it loud and clear. And I just wanted to, as the first question perhaps to Arab, is just, have you got any more updates, Arab, on your father's condition? Obviously, one of the advantages of having prisoner releases is that some of those prisoners may have engaged with your father and can give us some information about what he's like and what he's going through. I know you've had difficulty as a family and as lawyers trying to contact him. But what's the latest we got from him?
The last time the lawyer has been able to see him was January 5th. And at the moment, we're waiting for the lawyer to be able to see him again. Hopefully, within the next few days, he will be able to, according to them. But they usually cancel just a couple of days before. In the last visitation, he was very concerned about the other political prisoners. He was saying that through his cell, a few other cells can hear him. So when he speaks to them, he got really concerned about the situation of the prisons in general. On himself, he, of course, knowing him, not having access to books bothers him, not having access to news and information bothers him as well, because the Israeli government is very obviously trying to isolate him from everything, from news, from anything, and even they monitor what the lawyer is allowed to say and not allowed to say to him as well, including family details and family news. He's not allowed to discuss details about family news, for example. And the lawyer has worked very hard in order to be able to get him some blankets and winter clothes, because he didn't have any, and it was very cold in there. But what bothers him is the lack of information, and he still is, as I said, injured and suffers. Like he can't sleep on his left side. He's still tries to heal because he didn't get any medical treatment after the assault that happened in September, where while he was shackled, 4 or 5 prison guards, while he was getting transferred, they stopped him, they put him on the ground, and they started beating him up until he lost consciousness for hours. And when he got to Magento prison, where he is right now in solitary confinement, he got there with, he lost his consciousness before he got there and stayed like that for hours. And I think that, this tells you that if the highest profile Palestinian political prisoner goes through this, it tells you the current conditions of the rest of the Palestinian political prisoners. We're talking about 110. That's, a minimum number, because it's only the documented cases of Palestinian political prisoners who got killed since October 7th. But of course, they don't make the news because they're not Israelis.